So
Okay. They gave me a message.
Good. I was like, I went through this earlier, so I thought we were all good to go, but now we're reloading things, so. And now there's 2 session hosts. Going live in 1 minute. Okay, looking better. Oh, now I get to see myself twice. I don't like that.
I guess I'll go ahead and share to have the splash screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. And our presentation is live. Everyone just, oh, here we go. All right, we got 8 attendees in the CVent platform.
Okay.
Excellent. Alrighty, welcome to everyone joining. My name is Rachel and I'm a session facilitator for this. This is my first session, so I'm having a little bit of fun figuring it out. I think we'll just give it a minute or 2 more to get everyone in, but Adam here has a great presentation with lots of content, so we don't want to wait too long. And then we'll get started. If you have any questions, please use the CEvent portal to ask your questions. We're going to save them for the end, and then we'll have some chance to answer them then. All right, well, we're at 4:02, so I think we should go ahead and dive in. So Adam, please feel free to take it away.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everybody for taking the time. I know that it's been a long day, and we're getting towards the end of it, so I appreciate you taking the time to sit with us and learn for a bit. So this session is about disaster recovery with a service continuity mindset, and wanted to start out by talking a little bit about our respective backgrounds, maybe why I think that I have any authority to be talking with you on this subject. Talk a little bit about the definitions of what I mean by service continuity and some pros and cons for that compared to a more traditional business continuity and disaster recovery approach. Then give the specifics around the project that I've been part of at UCLA IT Services for the last year, what we're doing as far as service continuity and where we're headed. And then hopefully, as Rachel said, we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. So a little bit of background around myself. I started out in computer science, but also was working in customer service and kind of melding those two to bridge the gap between some of the communication difficulties that often occur between technologists and their customers, really looking at at things from a customer service mindset have helped me to understand the perspective of the folks who ultimately were doing all of this for. And that led to 15 years in business continuity and disaster recovery. I started out at a company called Agility Recovery Solutions, doing workspace recovery, mostly for small and mid-sized businesses. And that gave me a lot of exposure to different approaches because we were consulting essentially with our customers who had their own environments, their own concerns, their own technologies. And in determining how to protect those, mitigate risk, and then recover when a disaster actually happened. It got my start just 2 weeks before Superstorm Sandy. It came ashore in New Orleans, in fact, and it's been a wild ride ever since. What I'd like to do next, actually, is have a quick pop-in survey. So if you feel up for participating on your personal device or on your laptop, you can either navigate to popin.it/NRCEFC or scan the QR code that's there on the screen. And I just have 3 questions that I'm asking folks to answer. And that's going to give us a little bit of context and hopefully wake us all up a little bit as well. Thinking about you as the audience, what is your familiarity and your day-to-day responsibility for business continuity and disaster recovery? Am I speaking to a room full of experts or folks who are experts in your own areas, but perhaps are new to thinking about business continuity and disaster recovery in a formal way? The second question is just around how you define disaster recovery or what it means to you. And then the third is something that you're hoping to take away from today's session. I believe I made them all optional, so if there's one that you're not sure of, feel free to click through. I'll give everybody a few seconds to take a look at those, and then we'll pull the results up on screen. And the reason I wanted to do this was to be able to tailor the session a little bit. If everybody's new to BCDR, we may spend a little bit more time on the definitions as opposed to if this is everybody's day job. So we'll go ahead and switch that over. And refresh. It looks like we've got 9 folks responding. It's not showing me the results as of yet. Let me just check in case everybody skipped over this question. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. Don't have the data here in front of me, but understanding a little bit as we get to the Q&A session, where you're coming from and how this fits into your own responsibilities at your campus, we'll be happy to dive into some of those specifics. As far as what is a disaster recovery plan meant to recover, in the literal definitions, that would be the important IT applications and data. The critical people and functions, we'll talk a little bit more from a business continuity perspective, and then all elements of an organization could either be crisis communications, crisis response, or even service continuity, which is what we'll be talking about here today. And then excellent. We do have some answers here. So folks are interested in more options for DR and to see what others are doing. We'll be happy to speak some about that. We're not going to get too much into a technical solutioning, but happy to address some of that in the Q&A portion. Tips for getting started, we can certainly cover that. How to guide people through developing a DR plan. That's an excellent one, really thinking about how do we bring this out to our community and to our stakeholders, our constituents. Understanding what goes into DR, data and compute DR. Fantastic. Okay, so you're in the right room. We're off to a good start there, and I will do my best to address all of those concerns. So starting off from a service continuity perspective, what do I mean by a service continuity mindset? These are my definitions. There are other definitions out there. These aren't terms that I've invented by any means, but just as a solid foundation for us to start from. Service continuity is the focus on critical service resiliency in order to minimize downtime to those critical services by incorporating several different components, including resilient design, risk mitigation, high availability, system and or process workarounds. So if the primary system goes down, do we have another system backing it up, or process workarounds to manually do the process in the interim? And then communicating with business owners, ensuring that there's a clarity of expectations around what's going to happen in an actual recovery scenario. Some other important definitions that, from my perspective, fall under this umbrella, this concept, this mindset of service continuity are the traditional business continuity plan, which documents the steps to resume critical business functions when those normal operations are interrupted. So those can be things on the business side, like payroll. It can also be teaching and learning. It can also be IT functions around support and provisioning wireless, et cetera, everything that we do every day. Now, that's complementary to a disaster recovery plan that documents the steps to fail over and fail back your IT systems after an outage, either because they have failed entirely or because they're operating in a degraded state. And so we need to switch over to the disaster recovery mode or restore from backup, whatever that plan looks like. A couple of other definitions and acronyms that I may be using as we go throughout: business impact analysis, or a BIA, sort of ties those two concepts together, the business continuity and the disaster recovery. So these are documents that we tend to complete via interviews with stakeholders to understand the requirements and dependencies between those business functions and then the IT systems that support them, so that we know if these IT systems go down, these are the impacts to the actual business and anything that we can do to mitigate those impacts. Our recovery timeframe objective, RTO, is the length of time that we're expecting, that we're estimating to restore our operations, either in the disaster recovery environment or back into the actual production environment, depending on the length of that time and what strategies we're using. And that's complementary to, and a similar concept to, recovery level, or RL, as we'll refer to it, which is the Office of the President's IS-12 definition of this criticality. So each of those recovery levels, 1 through 5, do correspond to a level of criticality for the system, as well as a recovery time frame. So an RL5 system needs to be back up within 15 minutes after an interruption, essentially high availability. It needs to be always on. Whereas an RL1 system can be down for up to 30 days without having unacceptable impacts to the business. So we'll also be referencing those RLs. Now, this may be familiar to some of you, it may be less familiar to others. This is probably my most graphical slide, but I'll break it down and talk about each of the different components. So we have a timeline here. This is a traditional business continuity disaster recovery timeline, where on the left, we're looking at before the disaster. That POW in the center is our event, our disaster, and then on the right is how we recover. So one concept that we haven't really talked about yet is the recovery point objective. We can just think about that as how often we're backing up our data, because that then corresponds to if the disaster event occurs at the worst possible moment, right before we take those, let's say, daily backups, then what is the maximum amount of data loss that we experience by then restoring from our last viable backups? So in that example, 24 hours. So that's the recovery point objective. After the disaster, we have that RTO, the recovery time objective that we talked about. How long is it going to take to stand these systems back up? And then I've added in a little notation here, the work recovery time. This isn't always considered in the traditional timeline, but that's how long it's actually going to take the folks who are performing their functions to be back and ready to work. So think of this in the sense of our system is back up, but we still need to go through validation steps. We need to communicate out to the stakeholders and the users that systems are back up and restored. We may have some processes that are, some batches that are still running in the background to catch up our data. We may still be encountering individual user issues with reconnecting. So that work recovery time is filling in the rest of the time until we really need to be back at that required recovery time. And then at the very bottom there, we've got our maximum tolerable downtime. That's usually a business continuity term, looking at it from the perspective of the stakeholders, the users. How long can we afford for this to be down? It's not quite the same as recovery time frame objective, because as we can see, there's some extra time that it can take for us in there. Now, let's compare that to a service continuity timeline, shifting our perspective a little bit. Where do we have opportunities to have this service continuity mindset to mitigate risks and implement some of those elements that I mentioned in our definition of resilient design and whatnot? So with resilient design, that can be any number of architectural solutions, workplace independence. So having design strategies that include not being tied to a particular workspace or a particular data center. This may mean cloud solutions, but we'll talk about some alternatives as well. So if you can access these systems from anywhere, there are fewer opportunities for an impactful event or an event that's going to impact everybody. So if VPN stops working, then either we have alternate VPNs or we still have some folks on site and they're able to perform their functions. So we may be operating in a degraded state, but we've still mitigated that risk somewhat. The risk mitigation, this is an understanding of what are the risks in our environment, both human and physical, weather related, et cetera, that could impact these systems or our overall environment as a whole. And how do we try to shrink and lessen the impact of some of those? So things like third-party risk management, physical security and cybersecurity when it comes to your data center, having redundant power supplies so that if utility power goes down, we're not seeing an impact that takes down our entire data center. Those would be risk mitigation. So we're decreasing the likelihood that we're going to have this disaster event. Now, the cause may still happen, the utility power may still go out, but it won't necessarily be a disaster if the impact isn't there because we've mitigated our risk. If we implement solutions around high availability, if we can have multiple systems in different availability zones or different physical regions that are performing the same functions, maybe even load balancing across them in production, then if one goes down, the other one is still up. So that high availability is going to reduce or negate that downtime that we see while we're implementing our recovery. And then as we come over to the right-hand side, collaborating with the process owners, with the folks who are actually performing these critical business functions like we talked about. By talking with them, we're going to have a better understanding of that actual work recovery time and when that required recovery time frame is, so that we don't see situations where we brought the system back up and we think that we succeeded, but it turns out that it's been an unacceptably long time because the folks who we were collaborating with had a different understanding around what that maximum tolerable downtime was. And then coming down to the bottom, we do have one more note there around workarounds. And if we're able to also communicate with those partners, with those customers around manual workarounds or system workarounds, alternate systems that they can have in place to switch over to. So if Slack goes down, we have Teams, or we've got a phone list where we can instant message folks, or if a payroll system goes down, we have the paper forms that we used to use so that we can send those off to a third-party processor on a short-term basis while we're restoring that primary system, as an example. So those are a couple of ways, or several ways, I should say, of considering the difference between this BCDR mindset and this service continuity mindset. We're looking for ways to improve not just at the time of disaster, but ahead of time as well. So why wouldn't we do this? What are some pros and cons? This can largely be summarized as it's more expensive to think about things in this way. So some advantages, both at time of disaster and on an ongoing day-to-day basis, would be increased uptime, better customer service, because the service we're providing our customers is for these systems to work as expected. That results in a positive reputation. If folks see that we're taking resiliency seriously ahead of an event, we're understanding that this is a critical system for them and putting steps in place and architecting the system in such a way that is less likely to go down. As we're having these conversations, we can also discover new, more efficient ways to run certain processes. Maybe it's going through multiple steps when it could be a more direct route. And we can also fix some of the inefficiencies that we uncover as we're understanding what those critical processes are really looking to accomplish. There's other side benefits as well in terms of flexibility for remote work and other accessibility and DEI benefits from the perspective of taking on more responsibility as a service provider for flexibility and for resiliency, instead of relying on our customers to put in those additional resources or have that flexibility on their side. It's shifting the responsibility somewhat there and being a more equitable workplace. On the cons side, there is some additional cost of having redundant systems in place, particularly when we talk about high availability, or in some cases, moving to the cloud is a very cost-effective solution. If we're looking to do a full lift and shift, it can cost a lot more, and that is something to plan for. The maintenance time and cost of having these plans and then ensuring that they're renewed and kept up to date on an ongoing basis is going to require a team of folks to be dedicated to that task. It does require commitment from a top-down leadership approach. This isn't something that one individual is going to be able to accomplish on their own. It's a cultural shift. And there are other requirements as well from an experience perspective. One thing I wanted to call out with the ongoing versus at time of disaster efficiency, what I mean there is, if we're looking for greater efficiency at time of disaster by spreading out our systems and making sure we don't have any single points of failure, if we've got multiple nodes spread out across geographic areas, those stretched clusters, that geographic dispersal can result in higher latency in the production environment. Or if we're backing up offline, taking tapes and sending them someplace offsite, that's a more resilient backup because it's less likely to be impacted by the same, let's say, fire that affects the production system of the data center. But it's also less convenient. It's more protected, but it's slower to restore, because then we need to wait to have those tapes shipped back. It takes longer to restore from tape than it does from disk. So these are some considerations to take into account. We want to find that balance between an efficient and effective production environment that is also resilient and doesn't have those single points of failure because we have all of our eggs in one basket. And then from a human perspective, if we're going out to our stakeholders or our application owners and we're suggesting improvements and ways to shift the mindset, that can sometimes be taken as criticism of all of the hard work and all of the thought that they've put into the processes and the systems the way that they have them today. So that's something to have in the back of our minds about being careful and treading lightly. Mentioned the cloud briefly on the last slide. I did want to mention that sometimes there's a tendency to say, oh, we'll just move everything to the cloud. We're done. While the cloud is an excellent solution, it's not a panacea in and of itself. So there is a difference between transferring risk to a third-party provider and eliminating risk. So just because the axe doesn't fall on your head when the data center goes down, that doesn't mean that all of the data isn't still in a single place. So be aware, if you're looking to cloud solutions, of language around availability zones, or different providers use different terminology. Have some awareness of the physical locale of where the compute and where the data is being stored. We'd already mentioned a bit about cost, complexity. So cloud is a fantastic solution and certainly something that all of us will continue to incorporate into our plans. But I did just want to call out that it's not a one and done. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk for the remainder of our time about the specific project that we're accomplishing at UCLA ITS. A little bit of background first. I mentioned that I've been doing this for about a year, so wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of how things were as of last year. This image on the right-hand side is what I think of as the 4 pillars of service continuity. So we need resilient infrastructure, meaning our data center, essentially. We need resilient systems. So on an individual application level, thinking about resiliency in terms of multiple nodes or system workarounds and alternatives. On the right-hand side is the planning and documentation. And that's really where this project is focused. So that's why I've got it circled in red. And then down at the bottom is the testing and exercising. Incredibly critical, but difficult to accomplish until the plans and the documentation are in place. And so that's something that you'll see us talking about as something that we want to continue to grow as we move forward. So we have a very active Office of Emergency Management and Business Continuity Planning group that we're and continue to reach out to various campus departments. We had historically some excellent IT disaster recovery plans, but over time, many of those had lapsed, were no longer as current, or were missing. The folks who had come in weren't as familiar with the plans. And so it's all well and good to have a plan that sits up on your shelf, but if folks don't know where it is and to go pull it down, and the steps don't help in restoring the systems as they stand today, it's of limited use. So that was why this project was started and where we had some opportunities. From an infrastructure resiliency and system resiliency perspective, we're in very good shape. So the application owners and the data center team understand the concepts around risk and resiliency and had done a lot of excellent work there. There was a lack of understanding about the impacts when there was an outage or an incident. And so that was something that we wanted to look at and kind of structure all of this under the guidance that UCOP provided with IS-12. And then I'll mention as well, there were some other projects that we need to collaborate with at the same time. And so have an awareness of, we're not going to be the only folks talking to these application owners and having asks of their time. So that was something to have in context as well. The scope of our project overall was a standard project management approach of defining our goals as first, knowing our current state. What are all of the applications and services that we're responsible for? How do they interrelate with one another? What does that web look like so that if one goes down, we understand what else is impacted? And then understanding how do we recover individual systems, again, in line with that IS-12 requirement. So that's what we've been working towards. The timeline with where we are today, you can see we are in that implementation phase. We're creating disaster recovery plans. I'll go through in the following slides a little bit of detail around what those initial steps looked like. But just to give you a sense, this is an in-flight project. It is a multi-year project. You'll see that it goes off the page to the right. We know some of the other things that we need to accomplish, but didn't want to be overly aggressive in terms of setting timeframes when we're a small team and we understand that there may be other pulls on our time and changes in focus. So as far as the current state, where we are today. So the first thing we wanted to do was understand what is that universe of applications that we're responsible for. We conducted surveys with various managers and captured over 300 applications and asked them a series of questions that were easy for them to identify without going out and doing a lot of research. So we weren't asking, for example, how many users log into your application on an average day, but instead we said, bucket it for us. Do you have fewer than 100 users, 100 to 2,000, or more than 2,000 users, for example? Is your system hosted on premises or in the cloud? Is there an existing disaster recovery plan that you know of? High-level questions that we then were able to use to assign some type of priority and begin bucketizing these systems to understand which ones needed the most attention. We then follow that up by conducting interviews with these team leaders and these application owners to understand, does this feel right? Is there anything that we've kind of misaligned in terms of these priority buckets? So something that we didn't necessarily know was most critical, but because of this critical function that it supports, it may be a small group of users, but it's incredibly important that this system always be up for them. So it does need more attention. So we made some adjustments from there. What that allowed us to do is bypass this tendency of the subjective weight that folks tend to give to their applications when you ask them directly, how critical is it, or how long can it be down for? So by asking these higher level questions, we were able to work our way around that, but still get to good and more objective answers around priorities. As we went through and were having these conversations, we also began a risk registry so that we were identifying gaps and risks throughout these conversations. And then we're able to bubble those up to leadership and say, here's some of the things that we've discovered. Here's what we think the likely impact is, and how likely this risk is to actually manifest. What do we want to do about that? Is this something that we want to initiate a project to mitigate these risks and look at workarounds? Is this a risk that we're willing to accept or just insure against, depending on the context there? Middle column here around disaster recovery plans is where we are right now. So we've completed a pilot project and are currently engaged with our highest criticality application owners, so the RL4s and 5s, to understand what the specific recovery steps are if this system goes down. So that's what I mean by DR plan. This is the plan where an engineer should be able to sit down with it when the system goes down and go through actually bringing it back up in disaster recovery or restoring it from backups, depending on the system and what that strategy is. And then go through validation steps and say, okay, we did it, we brought it back up, either in a test exercise or in an actual live event. And then we'll talk a little bit about UCReady as well, which some of you may be familiar with, but we wanted to use that as our tool for holding and building these disaster recovery plans. Our business continuity side and OEM were already utilizing it so that we could tie things together from that perspective. But we did find some opportunities for enhancements in terms of finding ways to increase adoption among our application owners. And because we are a small team, we wanted to ensure that we weren't the bottleneck. So it couldn't be a matter of Adam going out and writing 300 disaster recovery plans, but instead finding ways to create templates and train the application owners, who are in fact the experts anyway. They have infinitely more information about how to recover these systems. Let's show them how to document, keep those up to date, and then Adam can just come in and answer questions. I'm going to move quickly through a few slides here, just keeping an eye on time and wanting to give some time for questions, but I'm going to do a little more detail here around the application list and the process that we followed there with the surveys. I have a diagram here of our business impact analysis approval process. That's just a workflow that lets you understand a little bit about who are we talking to there on the left-hand side, and what does that approval look like to ensure that we've got buy-in from the application owner, their management, and the executive owner. We do want to pull in a lot more feedback from our business and functional owners and our stakeholders as well. But in the interest of taking a breadth before depth approach, so that we have the full understanding of our environment, that's currently a future state step in that process. A screenshot here of UCReady. Some of you may be familiar with it and using it at your own campus. Excellent tool built on Fusion Risk Management, which is a leader in the BCDR space, allows a lot of customization. And we're finding that it's helping quite a lot in terms of creating uniform and complete BIAs as well as disaster recovery plans. Something I did want to speak to a little bit more is our future plans. So this is all well and good. I've said kind of, whoa, at the end of this project, we're going to have these disaster recovery plans. While we will be moving to a maintenance phase and we need a defined end to the project, service continuity itself does not end. You may be familiar with a cyclical diagram that shows documenting plans, testing the plans, taking that feedback, and then going right back into updates. So whether that's on an annual basis is pretty standard, or some other time frame, there needs to be a mindset around keeping these plans current. So as we referenced earlier, if it sits on the shelf collecting dust, it's not useful. It's not a live plan. So we need to have that in mind. Other plans are having more conversations and coordinations with our customers, our users, to understand the impacts and make sure that they buy in to the timeframes and plans that we have for standing these applications back up. Increasing our utilization of UCReady to ensure that folks are familiar with it and not logging in for the first time in a crisis situation and trying to find their way around to access plans. Also, there's a simultaneous project going on with DR as a service, or DRaaS, that is scaling up and giving resiliency to some of our critical systems by allowing us to spin up those virtual machines in the cloud that we are currently participating in testing, and we have future plans to, once that is a proven solution, build that out further and leverage that as one more tool in our toolkit. And then conducting test exercises. So both tabletop exercises, which tend to consist of spending a half day or a day talking through a scenario, what would we do? And then functional exercises where we actually get hands-on and we fail over a system after hours or on a weekend to the disaster recovery instance and validate that it's working properly and fail it back, because you will always uncover some unexpected elements by doing it live, doing it for real, as opposed to just talking through and having some of those ingrained assumptions. Also wanted to mention, from a collaboration perspective, we're trying to talk with other teams at UCLA, both within IT services and other departments, to coordinate our efforts to enhance what they're doing from a resiliency perspective, and also be aware that we're not, we're trying to avoid going back to the same well over and over and asking the same questions, so sharing information. Also, wanted to call out my colleague Amit Singh of Berkeley and I are working on calling together some ITDR planners across the UC system to share best practices and challenges, and that's just a nascent group that's coming together, but has some real opportunities from a perspective of sharing those best practices and lifting all of us to ensure that we're in line with those IS-12 guidelines, and also protecting our systems and our customers, our stakeholders, as best we can. So great opportunities there, and that's certainly something that I would invite folks to do in your own work, is thinking about who are those other folks who we can pull in so that we're not just reinventing the wheel ourselves. Do you have some tips here around working with limited resources versus limited time? And what I mean by that is, when you're talking with your leadership team around building out a disaster recovery project, whether it's for just your team or across your campus, you have the typical project management balance or seesaw of the more people we throw at it and the more money we throw at it, the faster that we can get it done. On the flip side, if we can take our time with it, then a small team can be just as effective. So think through what those deadlines and those objectives are as you're building out your scope for your project, so that you can have an understanding of what resources you need to have in order to meet those objectives. Just very briefly, where to start, if you take one thing away from this presentation and want to implement back at your own institution, is defining what the priorities look like for which systems need to be restored most quickly. So what are the critical things that we as a team need to be able to continue doing? and then identify the gaps with your current state. And that's going to give you your low-hanging fruit, your places to start with around whether that's specific systems, specific teams, or it may just be a matter of communication. Hey, we've got great resilience strategies in place, but nobody knows about it. We really need to find a way to communicate out to our stakeholders so that they have increased trust in line with the reality on the ground. And then I have some considerations at time of recovery. So I would recommend from experience that you build out timeframes around when you'll need to declare the disaster and sort of start that disaster recovery program. So what I mean by that is if the power goes out, it may come back on in 30 seconds, or it may be out for a couple of days, and you don't know until it's back on. So as you're building out these plans, you need to have some understanding of working backwards from our maximum tolerable downtime and how long the systems will take to recover once we say go. What is that time when we need to pull the trigger? And you'll need to adhere to those timeframes in a moment of crisis, rather than just listening to whoever's yelling the loudest about restoring their system first. Trust asked you, you incorporated the regulatory requirements and the leadership guidelines and the priorities that have been identified with the project. So hold strong to those priorities and those timeframes. And just wanted to encourage everybody, if you have something new that you come up with, whether it's a question or a solution, to go ahead and share. And I do have my contact information here. I know that I've brought us right up to 5 minutes, but did want to turn things over. If there are any questions at this time, I would be happy to answer a couple of those. And any that I don't get to, please feel free to reach out directly, or I'll be monitoring questions in the CVent platform as well.
All right, we do have 3 questions in so far. So the first one is, what disaster recovery planning approach is recommended for vendor managed systems, for example, ServiceNow?
Okay, so if I understand the question, what I would recommend in those cases is, so you'll need to have an understanding of the current service level that you have in place with this vendor, along with a hotline. If you have a higher tier of support, that needs to be documented in the BIA as well as the disaster recovery plan. And then reaching out to, usually it's just going to be your CRM or your account manager as a starting point to understand what are their recovery timeframe objectives. What do they have in place as far as a disaster recovery program? When was their last test exercise and was it successful? And most of these organizations, particularly large ones like ServiceNow, will have ready-made cut sheets or a page, a compliance page to point you to that will give an understanding of their expectations. And you can then tie that back into, okay, we need this system back up in 4 hours. They're saying that it'll be back up in 2 hours. We're good, we don't have a gap.
All right, excellent. And then the next one, I think I'm going to assume pertains more to your implementation. Is there anyone reviewing the disaster recovery plans to ensure that they are complete?
Yes, excellent question. And I failed to mention, but that BIA approval process is very similar to our disaster recovery plan approval process. So in other words, we're working with the experts, the SMEs, the application owner, to actually document the plan, but then we're going back to their manager and then to the executive who directly reports to our CIO in our structure for approval of those plans before we say, yes, it's good to go. And then even when that happens, we do, again, have an annual review process set up whereby it's going to send us those reminders and it'll need to be refreshed and reapproved on a go-forward basis.
Okay, so do you have a UCReady DR plan set up so that if a specific scenario happens, all DR plans for that scenario are still easily accessible?
Excellent question. So I think where this is coming from is, are we not putting all of our eggs in one basket with UCReady? And there are two answers to that. One is that UCReady is itself a resilient system. It is hosted by Salesforce.com and in their cloud, and so there is resiliency. That said, can it go down? Absolutely, any system can go down. And so the recommendation that we have with all of the application owners we're working with is once your DR plan is approved, we have instructions right there on the page to go ahead and print that out as a PDF, store it locally on your computer. You can print out physical copies, make sure that you have access to that without having access to UCReady. So yes, we do have some strategies around resiliency for accessing those plans as well.
Perfect. All right, we have one more question, but just before I ask that, I want to make sure to let everyone know that there is a survey tab in cVent, and the facilitators have very much asked if you guys can go ahead and take a chance to provide feedback, because that's very important to how we conduct UC Tech presentations in the future. We have 1 minute left, so let me see if we can fit one more question in. Have you connected with Amina at UCOP? She can facilitate connecting DR IT professionals.
Absolutely, and thank you for that tip. Amina Asefa is fantastic. She supports the UCReady tool, and that whole risk and safety team have been integral in us making improvements to UCReady. They've certainly been a partner for us there. And we do also have them in the loop as we start thinking through some of these strategic questions as well. So. Yes, great tip, and I would certainly forward that along to anybody in the audience as well.
Okay, we had one last question come in. Let's see if we can fit it. Are your plans scenario based?
Short answer, no. I've found that historically it's more helpful to think about impacts. So is the impact to just this system, to a group of systems, to a full data center or the full campus, as opposed to thinking about specific scenarios? Because particularly from an ITDR perspective, that response is going to look very similar whether it was a flood, a fire, or a wind-based event that took out the data center. So that's been my experience in the approach that we're taking.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam. That was a great session. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We had nearly 40 attendees at our height. Very great time. And for those of you who are in Berkeley, I believe you get to go enjoy a dinner. For those of you not, have fun doing whatever you do after work today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel.